The afternoon sun in Ouagadougou burned without mercy, casting waves of heat that shimmered above the cracked asphalt. The air was thick with dust, diesel, and the murmuring rhythm of a city constantly in motion. Vendors shouting from curbside stalls, motorcycles weaving between cars, the occasional bark of a street dog echoing off concrete. In the middle of this chaos, a modest, unmarked vehicle moved quietly down the boulevard. No sirens, no blacked-out SUVs, no blaring motorcade announcing importance. Just a single car, government plates barely visible beneath a film of dust. Inside sat President Ibrahim Traoré, dressed not in regal formality, but in the plain olive fatigues of a soldier still loyal to the soil that raised him. Had just left a local development meeting. Long hours of reports, maps, and figures. His face was calm, but his eyes flickered between thoughts. It was meant to be a quiet drive back to the palace. Routine, uneventful, until the car slowed near a congested intersection. There, barely visible between the crowd and a vendor's umbrella, an elderly man, barefoot, hunched, skin darkened by the sun and lined by time, struggled to push a wooden cart uphill. The wheels resisted every inch. His back trembled under the weight. Nobody stopped. Nobody looked. Nobody, except Traoré. For a heartbeat, the president said nothing. Then, with a sudden urgency, he leaned forward. Arrêtez la voiture. Stop. The car. The chauffeur glanced at the mirror, confused. The guards stirred, but the president's voice was not to be questioned. And just like that, everything changed. Not just for the man on the roadside, but for a nation watching what it truly means to lead. The moment the presidential car stopped and the door opened, the rhythm of the street shifted. Heads turned, vendors paused, conversations hushed. From the back seat stepped not a figure hidden behind layers of security, but President Ibrahim Traoré himself, his boots touching the dust without hesitation. He walked straight toward the old man. The man didn't notice him at first. His eyes were low, locked in a quiet battle with gravity and fatigue. His hands, calloused, cracked, and caked with grime, gripped the worn edges of his cart. His back arched in protest, his breathing shallow. His sandals were barely holding together, frayed rope and torn rubber. His shirt hung loose on a frame thinned by hunger, not age. His face, darkened by sun and suffering, was a map of lines, each one a memory of hardship, etched into skin. Yet there was no begging in his eyes, only exhaustion, only perseverance. Bonjour, mon frère, the president said softly. Startled, the man looked up, first at the uniform, then at the eyes behind it. Confusion gave way to disbelief. What's your name? Traoré asked, stepping closer. Mansa, he replied hoarsely. I was once a carpenter, a builder, a craftsman once known in his neighborhood for precision, for making things that lasted. But an accident at work had left his right hand partially paralyzed. With no insurance, no pension, and no family able to carry the burden, his workshop closed. His tools were sold. Years passed. Poverty moved in like a permanent tenant. Now he pushed a cart of scrap metal through the heat, just to afford bread. The crowd swelled around them, watching this unexpected meeting of power and poverty. Mansa was not just one man. He was a mirror. A symbol of the silent thousands slipping through the cracks of policy reports and economic graphs. And Traoré? He was no longer just a president. In that moment, he was a listener, a witness, a leader meeting the raw truth his spreadsheets would never show. A murmur rippled through the crowd, half astonishment, half disbelief, when President Ibrahim Traoré suddenly knelt beside the wooden cart. No one expected it. Not his aides, not the guards, not the small vendor boy holding a rusted umbrella. Cameras weren't rolling. This wasn't a staged event. And yet, there he was, dust rising gently around his knees as he examined the warped wheels and cracked frame of the cart like a mechanic, not a head of state. Mansa looked on, speechless. Sir, you don't have to, he began. I do, Traoré interrupted gently. This cart, it carries more than metal. It carries your life. Behind that moment was a memory. A younger Ibrahim watching his own father walk home, clothes soaked in sweat and tools slung over one shoulder. His father, a mine laborer, never begged, but his hands bore the burden of nations that profited while men like him paid the price. Traoré had seen those hands tremble, had watched calluses form over years of unseen sacrifice. So today, when he looked at Mansa, he didn't see a stranger. The guards stood frozen. One instinctively stepped forward, but was waved back by the president. Several passers-by began recording on their phones. A local journalist dropped his sandwich and fumbled for his camera. No one could believe what they were seeing. A man revered across the continent crouched in the dust beside a cart, in the heat. in public. He stood up slowly. "Let's move it off the road," he said, gripping one end. Mansa hesitated, unsure if it was a command or a miracle. Then wordlessly, they pushed together. The wheels groaned. The wood creaked. The crowd parted. Together, the president and the poor man rolled the burden to the side. And with that gesture, simple, unplanned, yet seismic, Traoré turned a roadside inconvenience into a national metaphor. Leadership wasn't standing above the people. It was kneeling beside them. It was walking in their shoes, even if they were broken. What began as a quiet act on a sun-scorched street turned into a national storm. Within hours of President Ibrahim Traoré helping Mansa push his rickety cart, the footage, captured shakily by a teenager on a borrowed smartphone, exploded across social media. No filters, no edits, just raw humanity. The clip swept through WhatsApp groups like wildfire. Instagram reels looped it endlessly. TikTok users added emotional music and narration. Twitter headlines screamed, "President pushes cart with poor man, a moment Africa will never forget. Not above us, but with us." Traoré's gesture shakes the nation. News stations cut into scheduled programming to replay the scene. Talk shows dissected every frame. Even international outlets picked it up. Some skeptical, others stunned. But for the people of Burkina Faso, there was no debate. This was real, unfiltered, unscripted. Radio callers choked up as they spoke. "He reminded me of my grandfather, who died with nothing but his tools," said one listener. A market vendor texted in, "I've never seen power bend like that. It gave me hope." In schools, children began writing essays about what leadership should look like. In mosques and churches, sermons drew lessons from the president's humility. Civil servants, some hardened by bureaucracy, whispered to each other, "Maybe change is coming." The pressure to issue a formal statement mounted, but Traoré refused theatrics. He took to national radio that evening, voice calm but resolute. "I saw my father in his eyes," he said, "and I remembered why I serve." He didn't speak for long. He didn't need to. That one sentence echoed across the nation, louder than policy papers or party slogans. It wasn't a photo op. It was a wake-up call, and Burkina Faso was listening. That same evening, as the world buzzed with the image of a president pushing a cart, Ibrahim Traoré sat in his office, not basking in praise, but drafting a plan. He called for an emergency cabinet session. Ministers arrived expecting discussions but found a directive. "We are no longer talking," he said. "We are acting." With urgency in his voice and fire in his eyes, Traoré opened the meeting by replaying the video of his encounter with Mansa. He didn't need statistics to start the conversation. He brought a story. "This man is not an exception," he said. "He is the face of a forgotten generation." He ordered a nationwide audit, a full count of elderly citizens living below the poverty line. "We need names, locations, and conditions," he declared. "Not in weeks, in days." Then he unveiled what would become known as the Mansa Initiative, named in honor of the man whose silent suffering had awakened a sleeping system. The program included monthly pensions for senior citizens without formal retirement benefits, food security aid delivered directly to high-need households, mobile medical units deployed to remote areas, prioritizing the elderly and disabled, job reskilling programs to support aging artisans, carpenters, blacksmiths, weavers, whose hands still held wisdom but no longer found demand, home repair and shelter stipends for elderly citizens living in dangerous or crumbling structures. Implementation began not with feasibility studies but with executive orders. "We will not bury this moment in red tape," Traoré said. "We will resurrect it in action." Bureaucracy was bypassed. Governors were given 72 hours to report back. A task force of youth volunteers and local NGOs was mobilized. Trucks rolled out carrying supplies within 48 hours. No fanfare, no ribbon cutting, just work. Within a week, hundreds of elderly citizens received their first direct support. And it all began because one man pushed a cart, and one president refused to look away. Days after launching the initiative that bore his name, President Ibrahim Traoré did something few expected. Without press or protocol, he traveled to Mansa's home, not as a president seeking praise, but as a man honoring a promise. Nestled deep within a crowded district on the edge of Ouagadougou, Mansa's neighborhood was a patchwork of tin rooftops and cracked mud walls. Narrow alleys wove between sagging homes, their paths littered with broken stones and the quiet resilience of forgotten lives. Traoré stepped out of his vehicle and walked the final stretch on foot. No guards, no flashing lights, just dust on, his shoes and purpose in his stride. Mansa's home was barely a room. The roof leaked when it rained. The floor was packed earth. A faded photo of his late wife sat beside a rusty toolbox, a silent altar to better days. He had no electricity, no plumbing, no steady meals. But his back was straight, his handshake was firm. Dignity had not left him. "Welcome," Mansa said simply. Traoré sat beside him, not in a leather chair but on an overturned crate. He asked, "Questions?" Mansa answered with quiet clarity. "Mr. President," he said, "we are not lazy, we are not useless. We built this country once with our hands, but as we aged, we were simply left behind." That sentence pierced the silence. Traoré listened, not as a policymaker, but as a son of the same soil. "You won't be forgotten again," he said, his voice low but certain. "You deserve more than survival. You deserve visibility and dignity." He stood before leaving and clasped Mansa's shoulder. "Your story will not be a one-day headline. It will be a turning point." And in that moment, inside a crumbling home, history quietly shifted. A president didn't just hear a man's truth, he carried it. The story of Mansa became the spark, but President Ibrahim Traoré knew the fire had to spread. Within a week, he launched a bold campaign, not from behind a desk, but on foot. A national listening tour focused entirely on the country's most overlooked citizens. From the dry outskirts of Dori to the crowded alleys of Bobo Dioulasso, Traoré stepped into neighborhoods long neglected. There were no red carpets, no filtered lenses, just truth, raw and unvarnished. In one village, he met Aminata, an 82-year-old widow who lived alone in a crumbling mud house. She had survived wars, droughts, and the loss of 4 children. "I eat once a day," she told the president, "but I still wake up to pray for this country." Her eyes, clouded with cataracts, held the kind of faith few can carry. In another town, he met Diallo, a once-renowned tailor who lost his sight in an accident. Now, he stitched by memory. "My hands remember what my eyes forget," he said, with a smile that defied pity. "But the market forgot me." Seydou, a disabled artisan in Kaya, showed Traoré a wooden stool he had carved with one good arm. "I don't need charity," he said firmly. "I need a customer." Each encounter wasn't just a photo opportunity, it was a masterclass in humility, perseverance, and dignity. And Traoré didn't just listen, he took notes, asked follow-up questions, and personally ensured that each case received attention. But more than that, the stories reshaped the system. The Mansa initiative was expanded to include mobile rehabilitation units, braille-accessible communication, and microloans for elderly artisans. As he crisscrossed Burkina Faso, Traoré wasn't building a policy. He was building a promise, brick by brick, with voices that had waited too long to be heard. President Ibrahim Traoré understood that survival was not enough. Dignity demanded more than aid. It required purpose. The elderly were not just beneficiaries of compassion, but reservoirs of wisdom, skill, and cultural wealth. And so the next phase of the Mansa initiative was born, not as a handout, but as a handshake between generations. Across Burkina Faso, a network of intergenerational skill and heritage centers began to rise. These were not shelters, they were sanctuaries. Here, men and women like Mansa were no longer seen as burdens, but as masters of memory. Artisans who had carved wood by candlelight, woven cloth on ancestral looms, and forged tools by instinct now stood before eager students, not as relics, but as revered teachers. In Wahiguya, a young boy knelt before an old blacksmith named Cabaret and said, "Teach me to make what my grandfather once wore." In Bobo Dioulasso, a teenage girl watched a widowed elder stitch traditional embroidery and whispered, "I never knew our art could be this beautiful." These weren't just classrooms, they were bridges between the past and the future. And, at the heart of each was a story like Mansa's, proof that the poorest man on the roadside could become the soul of a renaissance. Children no longer called these elders by their first names. They called them maître, the French word for master. The honorific wasn't ceremonial, it was earned, and with it came a visible shift in the social landscape. Mansa, now cleanly dressed and holding a walking stick he'd carved himself, stood tall in one such center, surrounded by children who listened with awe as he shared not only how to build furniture, but how to build resilience. "The wood will resist," he said, shaping a plank, "but so must you." The country began to buzz with a renewed sense of pride. The wisdom of its elders had found a stage, and the youth, once trained to look outward, were now looking inward, to their own culture, their own roots, and their own heroes. What began as welfare had become a movement of empowerment, restoration, and national revival. And President Traoré, he was no longer just reforming policy, he was reframing purpose. What began as a single gesture, a president stopping his car, quickly transcended policy and governance. It pierced the national conscience, echoing far beyond the corridors of power. Soon, the soul of the nation began to respond. In the heart of Ouagadougou, a rising rapper released a song titled Push the Cart, its lyrics a poetic retelling of that unforgettable moment. The chorus wasn't about fame, money, or revolution. It was about empathy, leadership, and hope. Within days, the track topped the radio charts. Street artists began painting massive murals. One depicted Mansa, weathered but proud, beside Traoré helping push the cart, both framed by a rising sun. Another showed a chain breaking, symbolizing the end of generational silence and the dawn of dignity. Poets filled community halls and cafes with verse, sharing stanzas that spoke of wisdom wrapped in wrinkles, and dreams still walking in worn sandals. At bookshops and marketplaces, handmade posters bore slogans like, "We rise with our elders," and "Respect is revolution." In classrooms across the country, something magical happened. Children were asked to write about their heroes. Dozens of essays came in with the same title. "When I grow up, I want to be like Mansa. Not like a celebrity, not like a soldier. Like an old man with a wooden cart who never gave up." The cultural response wasn't orchestrated. It was organic. A national wave of gratitude, imagination, and identity. Other African leaders began referencing Traoré's example in their public addresses, calling for leadership that listens and policies that kneel. This wasn't just a government campaign anymore. It had become a movement, etched into the country's music, art, and memory. And like all true movements, it wasn't about a man, it was about a mirror, a moment where an entire nation saw the kind of people they wanted to be. Months after that unforgettable stop at the red light, a quiet yet powerful ceremony took place in the heart of Burkina Faso's capital. Inside the newly established National Museum of Dignity, an unlikely object sat on display. Mansa's wooden cart, polished only slightly, its cracks and splinters were left untouched, a testament to its journey, not a denial of it. The cart, that once creaked under the burden of poverty, now stood elevated, enshrined in glass, not as a relic of suffering, but as a symbol of reckoning. Artists had adorned the exhibit with words etched in stone. This cart once carried wood, now it carries memory. President Ibrahim Traoré arrived to speak, not as a head of state but as the man who had once stepped out of his car and into the soul of his country. Standing before the cart, he addressed the gathered crowd, dignitaries, school children, and Mansa himself, seated front row. "This cart," Traoré said, "carried the weight of the forgotten, but today it carries our promise. A promise that no Burkinabe should ever feel invisible again." The audience stood still, the air thick with reverence. Cameras flashed, not for spectacle, but for history. And in that moment, the meaning became clear. Leadership is not defined by podiums or power, but by presence, by what we choose to stop for, kneel for, fight for. Traoré didn't just see a poor man on the side of the road. He saw a reflection of a nation waiting to be acknowledged. And through Mansa's struggle, he discovered not only the fractures of his country, but the fire to heal it. The cart, once pulled by weary hands, had now pulled a nation closer to its conscience, and that, more than any monument or speech, would endure.